everybody, I'm Barney Taylor. Welcome back to In the Record Room, the YouTube show for all things vinyl and all things soul. It's my duty to remind you that if you're enjoying these episodes, please subscribe down below and like the episodes. That gives us the opportunity to keep pushing wonderful stories your way. Talking of wonderful stories, look who's here this afternoon. It's Karl Tsigdinos. Karl
Hi, Barney.
is DJ, collector, journalist, presenter, designer, artist. I've had the pleasure of knowing Karl for the last few years, and I'm thrilled to have you on the show, Karl. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Barney. Thanks. It's great fun to be here. I've enjoyed all the interviews you've done so far.
Oh, I'm pleased to hear it. Thank you very much. Well, you know how this works then. I've set you the task of choosing 3-ish records. We'll see where that goes.
That's a fiendish task to be asking of anybody who likes music.
Well, I'm looking behind you, and that's a lifetime of music there behind you. So
that's just the CDs. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
I know.
But before we're going to look at the records, and as you know, I add the records to this playlist that we're developing from the guests. I'm just going to begin by saying, Karl, where did it all begin for you?
Well, I like many people, I became fascinated with music very young, and I grew up in Boston, and then and back then you're talking pop music on the air, but Boston was like, I guess you have to scroll back and remember that in those days in America, music was quite regional. Radio was quite regional. So what was big in Boston wouldn't necessarily be big in New York or Washington, D.C. or Chicago or Detroit. So across the country, maybe 50% of a radio chart would be common across but not always at the same time. But then you'd have the huge international acts like the Beatles and things. And that's I think that was the point where I connected with radio, was when the Beatles hit America in early '64.
Yeah.
And of course, I made the same journey that loads of people my age did, which was you go looking for the originals.
Yeah.
You know, so you read the songwriter credit, you say, now who is Smokey Robinson? Who is this? Who is that? And then something very serendipitous happened to me musically, which was my dad got a job in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We moved there in 1965. So we landed in basically a suburb of Detroit when Motown was at its creative peak.
Wow.
When you had all of the other Detroit soul going on. You had Detroit rock and roll exploding, the MC5 and all of those bands.
Yeah.
And music was literally in the air around us. It was all happening. You had fabulous the AM radio stations playing anything and everything. You had the birth of FM radio. So when it was starting in the mid 60s, when it was becoming a commercial thing, it was very freeform. Yeah. I remember, and to this day, I remember a DJ doing this link on the local FM station in Ann Arbor. His link was side 1 of the new Rolling Stones album. Here's side 2, right? So, it was just nonstop excitement no matter where you turned. And for somebody like me who was completely hooked on music, it was just a great buzz. Yeah. And it was so ingrained in us at the time that my junior high school in Ann Arbor, which would be the equivalent of first to third year secondary school here, they put a jukebox in our dining room, in our cafeteria. Wow. And we were allowed to play it at lunchtime. And like young teenagers all over the world, the girls danced and the boys stood around and watched them.
I remember all of those kind of things.
Yeah, awkwardly shuffling while the girls were doing beautiful form dances.
Wow.
Yeah, so I mean, that's how cool it was. And that kind of leads me neatly to the first record I've chosen, which is, and again, the 3 records I have are not ultra rare. They're not, collector's items as such, but they have quite deep personal meaning to me and a great impact. And you kind of have those little videos, little vignettes in your head that you remember of them. And the first record, my first choice, and I'm going to actually rotate it so that it's sitting properly in the sleeve.
How lovely.
My first choice is Smokey Robinson and the Miracles.
Lovely.
And it's The Love I Saw in You Was Just a Mirage. I'll hold it up higher. And this is, it's not a Northern Soul track. It's kind of a mid-tempo floater, I guess you'd call it.
Yeah.
But it's one of those ones where you just are agog at how many rhymes he can come up with for Mirage. And also it just, to me, summarizes all that was sweet and beautiful at that end of the Motown spectrum.
Yeah.
And the thing that I particularly remember is that in my Boy Scout troop that I was in at the time, we went on a camping trip, and one of the lads brought a portable record player with him, and another one brought this. So we were in the forest, camping, and they had the record player out playing this over and over and over, because I think he only had like 345s with him.
Wow.
So this is actually, I think at this point might be my third copy of this 45. I've worn out the others.
I was going to say, when did you buy that? I mean,
I would have owned it new, but worn it out.
Yeah.
And so I've replaced it at least twice. So it's for me, and of course Motown was just massive in the Detroit area at the time.
Yeah.
It was massive all over the world, and it is a real crowd pleaser, in any situation. Like if you're DJing at a party or a wedding or something like that, if you're playing in a club, if you're playing on the radio, blast a Motown track. And the thing that's amazing about it, to this day that amazes me, is there are hundreds of them you can play, and people will know them. And I think in a way we almost take them for granted, because they are so almost part of our DNA. And it's nice to step back and listen with fresh ears. But The Love I Saw in You Is Just a Mirage is one of those ones that I always hear with fresh ears. You know what I mean? It's just a beauty to me.
It's an interesting point that you make, because Motown is such a perfect entry point. And it's such a common place for everybody to discover soul. But as you say, a lot of people, especially if you're playing, you can forget about it because you're trying to find the non-Motown stuff. And every now and again, you hear a Motown record, someone plays it out, and you stop in the tracks and you go, that's why. That's why it's so universal, because I mean, it's his own genre, really, isn't it?
That's happened to me a couple of times at your D8 club, where I'm in the audience, and and somebody throws in a Motown track, and I go, I haven't heard that in years, and doesn't it sound great? To hear it loud, and to see people's faces light up when they recognize the opening chords and the drum beat and the bass line and stuff, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing.
And it ties in with emotion. I was chatting, one of the first episodes I did was with Paul Davis, and we were talking about Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, and that's the song that he wants to be buried with and played at his funeral. And these are the songs which are the stages of our lives. They're the love songs we hear, the breakup songs, the sad songs, the happy songs. How did you get into collecting, Karl? So you were playing stuff on the jukebox and obviously immersed in it. So there must have been 45s everywhere you looked.
They were. I mean, they were selling them in the electronics shops, like in the UK they would have done, the shops that sold you your stereogram also could sell you records. But Woolworths and Kresge's, they had them, 5 and 10s. Then we had a very, very cool record store. Like the bookstores sold them as well, but Ann Arbor had a record store called Discount Records, which was just super cool. And that was serving the college community. So us high school kids, youngsters could go in and find really cool stuff, because that was part of, I think, a whole national circuit of really cool record stores that that serviced underground and soul and funk and all of those things at the time. I started buying 45s like I think most kids do. You buy a chart, something that's in the chart that you like. But I always seemed to buy things that weren't number one, if you know what I mean. Like, I liked something I heard that I thought was a big hit, and it turns out that maybe it was 49 in the top 100 or something. But I heard it on the radio and exactly. Those are the kind of records I always were fond of. And I guess the way I got into collecting was I just kept everything. I just kept adding records. The problem for me is that I like far too many genres, I guess. So I have friends who specialize solely in like ballad doo-wop or up-tempo doo-wop or rockabilly, or northern soul or whatever. But that's all they collect. And they don't want to know about anything else. My problem is I just love so much different music.
It's interesting though, because one of the things you're talking about is the explosion of Motown and the ubiquity of it, but it would have also motivated a million other people to set up their own record labels, to put together their own combos and try and record. So I guess another part of your story would have been the smaller labels, the less successful stuff. I mean, maybe
that leads me very nicely to my second record, which is also a Detroit record. And this is kind of, it's still soul, it's danceable, but it's at the other end of the sophisticated veneer spectrum of Motown. And it's Mind Over Matter by Nolan Strong on the Fortune record label.
Okay.
And of course, Fortune is one of those labels that it was basically a studio set up in an old storefront, and it sounds like it's actually set up in a garden shed. And they recorded Nathaniel Myers, Nolan Strong, but they also did rockabilly and gospel, and other things. And there's quite a cult around it now, but at the time, nobody really wanted to know about Fortune. You know, they were aspiring, but kind of slightly inept, and that gives it a real charm and so on. So Nolan Strong and the Diablos, and except that it was only ever an album track, there's a different Nolan Strong song I would have chosen if it had been a single.
Okay.
And it's the ultimate love song, or at least the ultimate title for a love song, which is "You're Not Good Looking, You're Presentable." That's my favorite. I know there's a man who's sleeping on the sofa for a very long time, you know.
But that's amazing, because partly that story is, you know, these smaller setups where people put studios in there, as you say, in the front of their shop or in a garage or whatever. And if you've gone to the trouble, you're going to record anybody who wants to record with you, I guess. You're not going to say, sorry, it's only this. So what you're actually describing just by holding up that record is the history of an endeavor, a small business, effectively.
The independent record labels, and they operated in loads of different ways. I mean, and as you say, you've gone to the trouble and expense of putting in even cheap equipment and shoddy, you know, a shoddy room, but it still costs you money. So you're going to, you know, you're out there looking for an act or acts to put in there. Maybe people come in and pay you $50 to make a you give them a master tape and they go off and have an acetate cut or something. You know, which is of course what Sun Studios was doing.
Of course,
you know, and so that, you know, that whole, at the time, it was all very, very exciting. You know, it was possible. You know, there was that dream of walking into a studio, making a record, and suddenly you're number one in the charts. It did happen, not very often, but it did happen. You know?
I think there's an equivalent nowadays. I mean, ironically, as we're on YouTube, where people feel if they post something, I mean, it's the ubiquity of platforms now, but there's still the dream that someone says, if I record something and I post it, or if I make a short film and I share it, it might be me. So that the romance, I guess, of creativity and following a dream and all of those things are what makes collecting vinyl so beautiful, because they're short stories about failed dreams sometimes, especially when you start looking at smaller labels or obscure records. And that adds to the beauty of it, I think.
It does. I don't think anybody ever walked into a studio and said, I'm going to make a record that only sells 7 copies. You know what I mean? They all dream of being on the charts, I think, and they all think, and admittedly, there are times when you play a record and you think to yourself, why did they release this? How did they think it would succeed? You know, but that's also part of the fun of it, you know, some of the surreal and bizarre recordings that got made. And then some of the sublime records that got made, you know, and as you know well, from a lifetime of looking at looking at the charts, listening to music, being in radio here and there, the best records don't always succeed, you know, and some of the greatest, you know, and I think what's amazing about that golden period of soul music in the mid 60s to very early 70s was the sheer volume of great records made. You know, thousands and thousands of great singles, thousands of, not so many great albums, but, you know, but certainly singles you could probably never get to the end of collecting, you know, great soul. And that's just soul. You know, that's just literally soul music. You start widening out into the remnants of doo-wop and a cappella and gospel and all of those other areas related. You know, like, you know, you would literally, you know, you'd end up like some of those guys you occasionally see in America who have like, you know, 1 million records in a warehouse, you know. Like, you know, and except that some of us get married and our wives won't let us do that stuff, you know.
That's the hazard of collecting, isn't it? Actually, the housing of collections and things like this, and the archiving. But what you're doing, Karl, and this is going to lead us into when you moved into radio, you're effectively sharing a love. You're curating an experience for people by choosing to play unusual, unknown, unheard of records, but importantly, sitting them alongside Smokey Robinson or the Four Tops, and bringing those two extremes together. And of course, I know, because I mean, you and I have chatted a lot. As you say, it's not just soul for you. I mean, you're synonymous with gospel music as well, aren't you?
Well, gospel gospel, you know, has been a big part of my life since really 1970, 71, 72. And I think the, you know, I kind of fell into it because there was a small chain of record stores in Boston. I went back to Boston for college. And a small chain of record stores called Skippy White's. And Skippy was a Boston legend. He had a few record labels, and he only died very recently. He died a couple of months ago, I think. And he sponsored radio shows and things like that. But his record stores essentially served the black neighborhoods. Almost exclusively. So he carried a lot of doo-wop, he carried a lot of soul, and you could find things that you wouldn't find anywhere else. And one of his shops particularly had a large gospel section. And, you know, I started again, you know, I kind of was rooting through and I said, oh, this looks interesting. What's this? You know, and I liked the cover, and records were cheap enough then that you could take a punt on them, you know, and, you know, it might be $3 or something for an album, you know, and if they were used albums, you get them for 50 cents. So why wouldn't you buy them if you liked the cover? Or, you know, you risked very little. And the lovely surprises I found, you know, discovering the Nashborough record label, which I think for a soul collector, you know, Nashborough and Peacock and stuff, they were, and Checker and Chess, they were using, you know, the same bands and musicians that were making the soul records to make the gospel stuff. And the gospel singers were every bit as soulful, if not more so. They were just, the lyrics were different, that's all. You know, they, you know, so, and many gospel songs, you can, if you took the word God out of it, I love God, and change it to I love you, it's a soul song. And a lot of soul composers did that. And then coming into the 70s, a lot of gospel artists did the same in reverse, and they ripped off the soul songs the soul singers who'd been ripping them off.
But so, it's amazing, and we'll talk later on about the set you played at D8, which was a real thrill for me because it was a predominantly gospel set. But I think before we get there, I need to hear about how you went from being surrounded, immersing yourself in the collection of vinyl, exploring, taking a chance. How did you turn that into a career? Because, I mean, this is effectively what you've managed to do, isn't it?
It's been part of my career, I'm very, very lucky, like, and I think, again, like almost everybody in my generation, I fell in love with music early on, and this actually, I'm going to skip my next record and go straight to the probably the most important thing in my life in terms of music, Barney, was this. It's my transistor radio.
Ah, look at that.
Yeah, my dad gave that to me the summer. I think I was either 9 or 10.
Wow.
And it was a gift. It was a birthday present from my parents. And it sadly doesn't work anymore, but I still have it all these years later. And the magical music that came out of that, I fell asleep night after night after night with this under my pillow and the music coming through the pillow. And I probably single-handedly kept the Ever Ready company in business, for, you know. But so radio was a magical thing to me, but I didn't know anything more than what was coming out of the speaker. Like that was it. Like, wow, that's a magical thing. Like, I was kind of like, ooh, you know.
The reach, of course, and the intimacy of radio as well, I guess.
Oh, it's very much because it's one-on-one. But my first year in college, I was studying one day, and my wall my desk wall backed onto the guy next door and his desk. And through the wall, I heard him playing like 30 seconds of a song, the intro, and then maybe the outro, and then do the same again and again and again. It was driving me nuts. I said, what is he doing? Yeah. So I went out and I went around and I banged on his door and I said, what on earth are you doing? Yeah. And he said, well, I'm preparing an audition for the college radio station. Ah. And I said, what? And he says, yeah, they're holding auditions. And I said, there's a college radio station and you can join it. And so I immediately put together an audition myself. But at the time, I was very much more into doo-wop and old rock and roll. Yeah. So that was the kind of what I put in my audition. And it turned out that they were looking for somebody who had that area. Now, we both got places on the college radio station, but that was literally the start of the bug. I worked in the college radio station for the whole 4 years I was there. Yeah. And I just absolutely loved it because radio is such a powerful thing. As you said, it's intimate. It's radio it's a solitary experience for your listener generally. Yeah. They're either in their car or their kitchen. Yeah. Communal radio hasn't really, listening to radio communally hasn't existed since before television, really. Television killed that. But so, you are talking, it's a powerful thing. The listener is supplying their own videos. Yes. So it's pre-MTV, it's pre-music video. So they're making their own pictures and associations with a song. You might be reminding them of somebody that they knew and loved, or an event in their life, or I think one radio critic very graciously described my show as being full of songs that were your favorite songs. You just didn't know they were until you heard them on my show. And I thought that was really lovely. I really liked that. Lovely. That's lovely. But I think to show you just a small example of the power of radio, when I was still doing The River of Soul on Today FM, that ran for 8 years. And at the beginning, very early on, I got a letter from an Englishman living in Cavan, I think. And he said, I'm so happy to hear soul music on the radio. He said, this is brilliant, play me a request. So I did. And then maybe 6 months or 8 months later, I got another letter saying, I've met this lovely woman, but she doesn't know anything about soul music. Will you play her a request? So I did. And then maybe a year later, I got a letter from him saying, we've gotten engaged. Will you play us a dedication? Wow. And a year after that, a dedication for their wedding, and then their first baby and their second baby. Oh, how beautiful. And then I had a gap where I was off the air, and I was on Radio 1 doing a soul program, and I got a text from him saying, we've had a third baby. Can I have another dedication? And so like his whole courtship and marriage and family were formed around listening to the radio, to my show. Amazing. And it's brilliant, isn't it? I mean, just, that's kind of the magic of something like radio compared to almost anything else. And I mean, it's different from DJing in a club, because in a club, obviously, you're in a group. And so you have a different set of memories. You have memories being with your friends and not Yahoo. But with radio, it's maybe somebody at home and they're very happy or very sad. You said very emotional. And, you can pick them up or let them down. And I know one time when I was still doing college radio, I was doing an all-night shift, and about 3 a.m, I got a phone call from a very depressed-sounding taxi driver who wanted a dedication. And he literally sounded like he was about to jump off a bridge or something. And he asked for a Phil Oakes track. And of course, Phil Oakes was a singer who committed suicide himself. So I said, I'm not playing it. Yeah, I'm not going to condone this. No, I'm not doing that. Sorry, I'll play something else. I don't remember what I played, but I tried to find something that would be slightly less, depressing. But it is a powerful medium, and I love that aspect of it. Yeah. And the listeners don't care what you look like. They don't care how you're dressed. And for me, I've always regarded my radio shows as being a bit like a giant sitting room. And you're kind of saying, oh, if you like these guys, you'll like this. Yeah. Or you must hear this. Oh, wait till you hear this, Yeah. And I've always tried to I like to play lesser known songs by well-known singers. So, if you only listen to classic hits radio now, you would swear that James Brown only had 5 or 6 hit records and Aretha Franklin had 4. And the reality was, James Brown had like 110 hit records,
Yeah.
and Aretha had 68 or something. So
Yeah.
you're kind of thinking to yourself, what about those other, 40 Aretha Franklin records?
Yeah.
And that's excluding all the quality B-sides and album tracks that weren't hits that should be played.
Yeah.
And that's that's the hollowness, I think, of the modern classic hits format, is that it misses all of that, and it forgets that at any one time, and every Friday for 50 years there was a top 100.
Yeah.
It was 100 records that people bought.
Yeah.
Now, and every week it changed, maybe 15 or 20% of it changed week by week, but they were popular enough to be bought. So that means that that somewhere there's a large bunch of people who wouldn't mind hearing that again, but they don't get played on, modern radio as much as they should.
Yeah.
And so it's nice, that thing of trying to lead people along. And I used to love getting messages from younger people, like you get a letter from somebody saying, "Hi, I'm in college. I've never heard this music before. Where do you buy it?"
Yeah.
And then you think, "Oh, you are ruined, son. You are ruined. There goes your bank account."
Exactly. Exactly. No savings ever again.
Never. No. And times when when you ate cream crackers for dinner because you just had to have that single or album,
I think that's really interesting, because we first met through Danny and Dublin City FM, and I know you're still doing Shaking Street, and I'll love to chat to you about that in a moment. But it was through Danny that we got you to play at D8, and exactly what you're describing about playing records that people may not have known, although actually D8, it was a very knowledgeable crowd. But I remember the set that you played, and you opened with the East St. Louis Gospelettes, If I Had My Way. I think you also played Martha Bass, didn't you?
I did. I played Martha Bass. I played the Chambers Brothers. I wish I'd written down what I played. But as you say, like the thing that's lovely about the D8 Club is that not only the audience is knowledgeable, but they are very open and enthusiastic.
Yes.
In other clubs, in other situations, I've played a record that people didn't know, and you clear the dance floor.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the funny thing is, and you should try this sometime, Barty, when you're if that happens, and you play a record early on and you clear the dance floor, play it again about 2 hours later. And honestly, I've done that where I played a record early on at a thing in college, cleared the floor, played it just for pig iron. I threw it on again 2 hours later, and everybody said, "Oh, I love this record." They were up dancing. They just needed to hear it once. You know what I mean? Like, just a bit of familiarity. But I think that's what's lovely about the D8 Club, is that it's much more open. I mean, it's not strictly Northern Soul by any means. You're playing disco and funk and all kinds of things, and the audience, the crowd are just there to have fun, and they embrace the sound. They're not. It's not a snobby thing, and I think, my initial impressions as an outsider to the Northern Soul scene were that's what it would be. It would be very cliquey. It would be very demanding, and would only want to be hearing really obscure tracks that that nobody else is playing or whatever. And the lovely thing is, you'd hear records that top the charts in the D8 thing side by side with things that nobody's heard before.
But it's interesting from your perspective, because Northern Soul wouldn't have meant anything to you as a phrase.
No, we didn't. I mean, it didn't exist as a genre in America.
No.
For us, it was just music you dance to or not. And in fact, it was all music you dance to. It was just whether you got to touch the girl and dance slowly, or dance, shake your arms about. Those are the two types of dance, slow and fast, basically. Yeah.
I think that's it. I mean, and our policy has always been, we've always trusted people who have been kind enough to come along with their treasured possessions and share them with us. I mean, you kept the floor full for the full 45 minutes.
Thank you.
It was
fun.
Full on gospel, though, wasn't it? I mean,
a lot of it was, yeah. And I mean, but you're talking about the same bands. You're talking about bands that were playing. They would have been the same bands playing behind all the chess and checker artists, or like the same musicians, so that those guys had grooves, like they, and you put a powerful singer like Martha Bass on top of that, you can't not dance, really.
No, I mean, and I remember your set opening with East St. Louis Gospelettes. I have an album
Nice,
sitting
nice.
here, and that's kind of proto-rap, isn't it? In many ways, it's
yeah. I mean, it's crossing. It's an intersection of about 6 genres, and I love music that sits in those crossroads of genres.
Yeah.
You know, so that's why I love. You know, why I love Little Milton and Bobby Bland, and because those guys move back and forth between soul and blues and gospel and country, nearly. You know, like and Roy Hamilton, and you know, and one of the interesting. Remember when? It might have been the second time the Blind Boys of Alabama came to Dublin.
Right.
And I was chatting to Jimmy Carter, who was also a blind boy of Mississippi before he was in the Alabama crowd. But we were talking about music, and as far as he was concerned, there were only 2 genres of music. There was gospel music and rock and roll. And that's it. So everything was either gospel or rock and roll. So Wilson Pickett was rock and roll once he left the gospel. Sam Cooke was rock and roll once he left the Soulsters. Yeah, that was it. There were only 2 genres of music.
And was that religious, secular? Was that
basically?
The transition?
And they just called the secular stuff rock and roll. Yeah. Yeah. Even though, and then I remember telling that story to BP Fallon, the legendary DJ, and BP said, gospel is rock and roll too. So, you know, so it's all in there in that mix. And, you know, that the beauty of gospel, I suppose, is that, you know, the singing is just generally so fabulous. Yeah. And you have the exact same, in a way, it parallels soul music. It was slightly behind soul music in terms of sound and production values.
Right.
So soul would have been getting steam 63, 64, 65. Gospel was still, they were probably still following in those early years in the 60s, still kind of following the 1950s formats.
Right.
But they were then influenced by the success of soul music and all that. And these singers were all working together. They were all friends. They all grew up in the same churches. They sang together. Yeah. You know, James Brown took the Swanee Quintet on the road with him.
Yes.
You know, so there was, you know, and a lot of the singers crossed over or tried to cross over. Johnny Jones of the Swanee Quintet made us one solo single, I think, and then gave up and went back to gospel. But many of them tried quite hard to cross over and get a bit of the financial success that the soul guys had. So they are not mutually exclusive. You know, they're totally interchangeable to me. And, you know, powerful singing, it's just the words. And if you're dancing in a club, you're not really hearing the lyrics anyway. You know, you're just getting the feeling and you know, you're feeling the rhythm and you're feeling the vibe of it. Yeah.
But I mean, as you say, it really, at that stage, when you're standing there, you've got your box of records open, it's what will make people dance. And as you say, people aren't going, well, yeah, but it's about God, so I don't know whether I can dance to that. It's just if there is that groove. And so really what we're just thinking about is dance music. Now, I know that not all soul is danceable. And that's, you know, thinking about the ballads, and that's another beautiful area. Not all gospel is danceable.
That's the slow set, Barney. The slow set. Yeah.
Exactly.
But they don't do a slow set anymore. And you don't do a slow set in the DA.
We don't do a slow. At the start, we always have the first hour, we call it pick and mix. So you can pretty much play what you want. And that's where people will play slower stuff. And I'll put on the odd Nashborough gospel keynotes or something and bits and pieces like that. But I suppose once you get to about 10 o'clock, people are revving up to dance. And so if you stick on something, there's an old Kent album on there called Black and Bluesy.
That's right, Slow and Moody, Black and Bluesy.
That's the one. And you think, well, if you start putting tracks like that, as beautiful as they are, people are going to be like, but I want to dance. I can hear that on Spotify. It's curious, though, isn't it? Because, I mean, I want to ask you about River of Soul. I know you mentioned it, but that was a mainstream soul show that ran for 8 years. What was the motivation?
It was quite remarkable, actually. It was a complete fluke. I was doing that show on Anna Livia, which was Dublin City FM.
That's right,
the previous guys.
Yeah.
And the studios were in Grafton Street upstairs over Stanley's newsagent, I think, at the time.
Yeah.
And I started doing it. It was, I think, in September, October one year.
Yeah.
And Today FM, or Radio Ireland as it was then, was being set up at the time. And I didn't even bother sending a tape in. I could just, there was no point to it. And I think they got like 10,000 audition tapes.
I bet,
DJs.
yeah.
So as it happened, though, Declan Lynch of the Sunday Independent wrote a half-page article about my show on Anna Livia, my soul program, and offered it to Radio Ireland as free radio consultancy advice that they should hire me, right? And he got a fax from, everybody remembers faxes, I presume.
Of course.
He got a fax from one of the directors of Radio Ireland saying, "Ha ha, very funny. Tell your man to send us a tape." So Declan rang me and he said, "Karl," he says, you should send these guys a tape." And I said, "Great, I'd better make one, hadn't I?" So I made a tape, and I actually made 2 copies, and I sent one to Radio Ireland, one to RTE, and they both came back offering me a gig. Actually, what happened was I was offered an interview with Radio Ireland, and offered a 6-week series on Radio 1. And I went in to do the interview in Radio Ireland, and a lovely chat, got a tour of the studios, but no offer of a job. And I left very, disappointed, but I liked everybody that I met, and I just wished, in my head, I was wishing them the best of luck. Although I was very disappointed I didn't get a gig. And then on the following, this was on a Thursday or a Friday, and then the following Monday I rang RT and I said, "I'd like to do that 6-week series."
Yeah.
And they said, "Why are you ringing us?" And I said, "Well, you offered me a 6-week series. I'd like to do it." And they said, "No, you're working on Radio Ireland." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And it had been in the Sunday newspapers that I was on the weekend staff. So I found out I was on Radio Ireland from somebody in RTE.
But that's fascinating, though, because there would have been a commercial remit, though, wouldn't there? So
well, they had a strict thing for they had to supply specialist programs.
Yeah.
And so they did the normal thing of an hour Monday to Friday.
Yeah.
But they liked the idea of soul and gospel, and they put me on Sunday morning originally.
Yes. Yeah.
And what was fabulous about that was that I could talk about the 10 o'clock watershed, for playing naughty records and things. But a show called The Sunday Supplement followed me, and it was set up by John Ryan, who did VIP magazine and all that. And John had envisaged his show. I think his show started at 11 and ran till 1. And they envisaged a sort of a yuppie couple having a lazy Sunday morning and maybe, a little bit of a groove, and then breakfast in bed and reading the papers. And that was the pace that they saw their show.
Yeah, yeah.
And then we started doing our full schedule dry runs, and they heard my show. And they said they realized that after they heard my show that their listeners would be having a post-coital cigarette at that moment. So I was very pleased about that.
So
but
you
it was
ruined
great
the yuppie
fun,
dream.
Exactly, yeah. But I mean, I was able to play I was given, the wonderful thing about it was John McColgan of Riverdance fame, who owned Radio Ireland, loved the show, but I had complete freedom to play anything I wanted.
Yes.
So my first 2 records, I can still remember the first 2 I played, were Wonderful by the Soul Stirrers, followed by Wonderful, Marvelous, or Marvelous, Wonderful by Jackie Moore.
Oh,
and those, so that was kind of, in a way, that was the whole remit of the program in one 2-record set. But I was able to play, the Spirit of Memphis Quartet. I was able to play Doug Clark and the Hot Nuts, Baby Let Me Bang Your Box. I could play kind of anything I wanted, and it was wonderful because I was playing lots of deeps and mostly ballads. Probably mostly deeper, slower stuff, and not overly concerned about being commercial. So I could play songs that I loved, and hopefully the listeners would love as well. And you could bring them along by the hand. I loved playing, I think I said earlier that I love playing lesser known songs by well-known artists. So, playing Aretha's version of Johnny Ace's My Song, which is my favorite Aretha track of all.
Right, yeah.
But then you could play a well-known song done by an obscure artist, maybe. Yeah. So you could play a song that they might know, but that's a different. Wow, I like that. But you could, you wouldn't go wrong with, obviously Jerry Butler, Curtis Mayfield, anything from Motown. But you could push the boundaries, and you could play the Invictus, all the Invictus stuff that came after Motown. And, it was so much fun. And it ran for 8 years, so it it was really cool, and I loved every minute of it. It was just I love doing radio as it is, and I particularly loved the River Soul. It was a big part of my life for that
Yes,
that
yes.
stretch.
It's amazing, interesting. Could be another thing that's come up in lots of conversations is flips. And so if you've got a single that has like a ballad on one side, they're often not double-side ballads, are they?
No, they're normally, I mean, the standard format was a dancer and a slowie.
Yeah.
That was the standard format for a 45. It's a very rare 45 that would have 2 fast tracks or 2 slow tracks.
Yeah.
Very rare. That was sort of the wisdom of the era, that that a radio DJ might play the slow song, but a club DJ might play the fast one.
Yeah.
And you're kind of maximizing your thing. And it's always wise to play the flip side. I know people who've owned 45s and never ever played the B side.
Yeah.
And I said, there's a Jimmy Soul song. I think it's Twisted Matilda, which is obviously not exactly the most enticing A side, but the B side is a great ballad called "I Can't Hold Out Any Longer."
Yeah.
And you'd never know, who's going to buy a 45 called Twisted Matilda?
They might buy it now. You've endorsed the flip, but it's kind of like
Gene and the Darlings, Soul Girl, their answer to Sam and Dave's Soul Man.
Yeah.
The B side, What's Gonna Happen to Me? Stunning ballad, brilliant ballad.
Yeah.
And it's a record because it's not it's just a fairly competent Stax or Volt 45.
Yeah.
But the you pick it up for a couple of bucks. I don't think it's valuable at all.
Yeah.
But a brilliant B-side that never appeared anywhere else, and so they're out there, and I guess though for me the ballads would have been the songs I chased.
Yes.
And for a long time, I mean, in the collecting world, and it happened with doo-wop as well, is that one group of collectors are chasing the ballads, but another group, guys like yourself and Danny, would be chasing the A-sides or the dance side.
Yeah. And
so the value of the record would go up, generally more to do with the value of the record in the northern soul market. So records that, and then that all changed again when you had the sort of the Fatboy Slim era of DJs coming in who are sampling from all sorts of things and mixing them into their sets. And of course, those guys earn so much money DJing that they can afford to pay anything on eBay or whatever for a record. Yeah. So suddenly records that were costing $5 are now $30, and records that were $30 are $100. And so that's happened to the gospel one. I mean, 10, 12 years ago, you could buy gospel 45s for very little. Yeah. Now some of them are going for hundreds of dollars.
They are.
Because they've been discovered for dancing and for sampling and all of that. So,
the funky gospel especially seems to be really maintaining a value or still increasing in value. Yeah. But it's interesting because like sort of soul jazz stuff doesn't always necessarily sort of suffer from the same. I mean, like if you buy some Jimmy Smith Verve singles and bits and pieces, they're not that expensive at the moment.
No. And there's lots of good stuff out there, like there's still lots of good records out there for cheap. And I guess this is maybe a nice time to introduce the next record.
Perfect.
Which is I mentioned her earlier, Jackie Moore.
Yep.
And this is a Paul Kelly song produced by William Bell.
Okay,
sung by Jackie Moore. So that's quite a triumvirate, and it's personally.
Oh, look at that!
Yeah, and this one is particularly meaningful for me because my late wife, wasn't hugely interested in music, but when she heard a record she liked, she reacted, and that was her favorite of my soul records.
Wow.
And anytime I played it, she reacted, and she kept asking me to play it on the radio. So it has a very personal meaning because my wife died in 2006. And so I associate that with the early days of my marriage and my young family at the time. But it's a beautiful song. I mean, and I think Jackie, like Paul Kelly did a version of it, but I think when Jackie recorded it was probably only a demo from Paul Kelly. He recorded it about 15 or 20 years later.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful song personally. And it's a lovely mid-tempo kind of song. So, you could dance to it just about.
I think you could, but I mean, sometimes we've been talking about this as well, but sometimes it is just like you held up the radio. It's something that is so much part of your life that single is, is everything. And it doesn't matter if people don't dance to it, because that's not what it means to you. You didn't buy it for that. You bought it for a very specific reason. And look, I'm really touched that you just shared it, because and also it's an amazing song. You know, so that's the other thing about it, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think I've heard a rumor, Karl, you've got a couple more records you were planning on shoehoorning into.
Well, as I said to you, choosing 3 records is a diabolical thing to ask of anybody, you know. And I mean, Jackie Moore and Smokey Robinson straight off were right in there, because they would be immovable in my top 10.
Absolutely.
And you know, most of the rest of the top 10 would be ever shifting. And so Nolan Strong made it in. Here's another one that I love, and this is one of those ones that sits, as I said, I like records that sit on the crossroads of genres. And one of the areas that I love is when doo-wop transitioned into soul. And so there's a lot of lovely records that came out in the early 60s that were still not paying a nod to records from 7 or 8 years earlier, but were also a portent of things to come. And this is one, The Volumes, I Love You, which is a real great up-tempo. Now this one you could play in D8. Sorry, I'm not holding it up properly.
No, not at all. I'll
talk to you through the middle of it. But the Volumes, I Love You, and it's just so much fun. You know what I mean? It's one of those records where there's just like it just kind of woof of emotion, and you go, wow! It just makes you smile, and it makes you want to shake, you know, move your feet as well.
That's quite an unusual record label as well, I think. It's got
Checks, the Checks label here. I'll take it out of the sleeve. So it's got that kind of thing that there are a lot of labels that were knocking around that were really simple, and my guess is they were probably just done by the printer. You know, somebody came in to set up a record label, and the production company, the guys that were making the record said, "Do you have a design?" And they said, "What?" "We'll design it for you." And they just got a bit of Letraset or whatever, and put some type down, and you know, and made the label. And I mean, it has that look of it, you know.
I mean, you're a designer as well, aren't you? So you know, as part of your background. So the text of a record label to me is beautiful, and sometimes it can be the name in the brackets after the song, as you were describing earlier, the name of the producer. Other times it's the choice of the font or the logo. Or whatever it is. And as you say, some of that was deliberately kind of fashioned to be complete. Others would have just been, that will, you know, we'll have a chess piece or something. You know, that's not a good example, but you know what I mean. So for me, one of the other things I love about the collecting of vinyl is the ephemera, the sleeves,
the visuals, and I mean, remember the lovely Checker record label? I wish I'd fished one out where they actually had checkers, like the little round discs with the word Checker spelled out in checkers on the sleeve. I mean, and Chess, of course, had the chessboard on it. You know, you had, I'm trying to think of some of the other beautiful designs. I mean, some of the sleeves were wonderful. Obviously, some of the Motown labels had the map of Detroit on the top half of the record label. And in fact, record number 5 has quite a surreal record label. I'm going to just hold it up for you. This one is a record from 1973.
Okay.
Can you see it? Am I showing it properly?
Yeah.
Little Richard, In the Middle of the Night.
Little Richard.
And it's on the Green Mountain record label. So it has a kind of a weird, it looks like it should be from San Francisco in 1967. But it's a gospel record from the early 70s. And it was one of the many times that Richard had moved back to gospel from rock and roll. And it came in as a promo to the college radio station, which is where I got it. And I remember playing it and thinking, you know, Little Richard, he's passé. And then I heard that and said, oh, no, he's not. You know? It's a slow gospel song. It's a love song to God, basically. And could very easily have been a soul song, you know, but that's how they recorded it. It's really beautiful, and it barely ever gets played anywhere.
No, it wouldn't. I mean, obviously he died last week, I think, or whenever it was. So the obituary is always about most of the time it's about the obvious, isn't it?
The
But as you
specialty
say,
stuff, yeah.
yeah, I mean, these, small things on obscure labels that don't look like they should belong there.
Yeah, Little Richard recorded for something like 30 different record labels in his lifetime. So
Extraordinary, isn't it?
He knocked around a bit. Yeah.
No.
But you think about all the great singers who were like that, like even some of the crooners from the 50s, like Billy Eckstine and stuff, who ended up recording for loads of different labels.
Yeah.
Motown took a swing with them. Stax would have taken a swing with them. And these guys were, they were loved within the black community.
Yeah.
They were loved by their fellow musicians and fellow artists and singers. And so that's why a lot of them ended up on so many different record labels, because everybody was just willing to take a punt on them, and think, well, listen, that's, that is Roy Hamilton. We've got to have it, we've got to record it. We've got to have a hit with him, and maybe they didn't, but. And then
they would move on to the next one, or there would be like a short deal, and then it would be, and also that's the story of the smaller labels as well, isn't it? Where maybe someone is on their way down and they might try and, but he was big once. Let's see if we can kind of
and that's why so many artists' discographies are quite interesting, And a lot of the times the records are they're okay, they're average, but sometimes they made some gems,
It's the stories, though, isn't it? It's the objects, it's the connections. I say this every episode, but it just, to me, it's the fact of the paper holding the vinyl, holding in your hand, then the story you tell, where it takes you back. When people are listening, they hear the same thing. And that's even before you think about audience. This is a personal journey for yourself. And then when you're sharing those stories over radio or on a DJ set, and you're sort of demonstrating to other people, this is how much I love this, now share this. It's just, Karl, I'm going to say, I must have you come back on the show. It's been a real thrill just to listen to you. I'm really touched by the stories that you shared as well. So thank you very much, Karl, for being on the show.
Great fun. Thank you very much.
Look, the pleasure is always mine. I simply sit here and say, show me your records, and then the stories continue. But it's a thrill. And listen, so if anybody's watching this, where can people still find you playing stuff now?
At the moment, I am on Dublin City FM playing a rock and roll program called Shakin' Street. I follow Danny and the Soul Seeker.
That's right.
So you've got an hour of great Northern Soul with Danny, and then 2 hours of mad rock and roll with me. And you can find us on 103.2 FM in the Dublin area and online at dublincityfm.ie.
Fabulous. And I'll put the links into the YouTube episode as well, so you can find Karl, and you can find Karl. You share your stuff on Mixcloud and Facebook as well, I think, don't you?
I do, yeah, on Mixcloud,
There are archives everywhere. It's a very different show to kind of like
the River of Soul. Very different. It's the other side of the coin,
It is.
But I think that it's one of the ways that modern radio has let listeners down, and why they're losing listeners, why commercial radio is losing listeners, is because they've narrowed their focus so much. They don't allow that, somebody like you might not only like Marvin Gaye, but you might like Dave Edmunds, or, you'd love Otis Redding, but you could also, like Nat King Cole or Charlie Rich. And, that's that thing of forgetting that there was always a top 100 every week after week. There was 100 records in the charts of all ilks, all varieties.
Yes.
And if you go back and even in the late 60s, early 70s, when we were hip youngsters, we thought that AM radio was sort of the commercial devil's spawn. But when I look at an AM radio chart now from that era, I would kill to hear those records on the radio.
Yeah.
I would love to, because a top 20 would have included, there'd be a Beatles and a Stones, there'd be an Aretha and an Otis, there'd be 2 Motown tracks, there'd be 3 or 4 local acts. So if you were looking at a Philly chart or a Boston chart, Detroit chart, there'd be 3 or 4 acts, 2 rock and roll, 2 soul, maybe and there'd be a blues artist in there.
Yes.
You might see a John Lee Hooker. There'd be a novelty track. There'd be a couple of crooners, so Nat King Cole or Dean Martin. All in the one chart, sitting side by side. And that was magical. That's the bit of radio that I love, that you can surprise people, that you can lead them by the hand, and they can say, oh wow, wow, I love that. Where did that come from?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the bit that's fun about it. Yeah.
But I think it's interesting when you talk about, basically you're describing the eclectic nature of taste, and how when commercial operations seek to cordon or narrow tastes in order. But then if you think about it now, and when you were describing the top charts, it sounded like my Spotify playlist. We now have our own control to, we program our own soundtracks now. And that's, I think, is a very interesting aspect of digital technology. I mean, I don't really listen to the radio because...
Yeah, but see, that's a shame, because what radio should do, and I think my measure of great radio is if you're driving in your car, and you reach over to turn up the volume.
Yes. Yeah.
When's the last time you did that? Listening to a radio program, and you only do that for two things. You do that because you say, "I haven't heard this track in years," or "What is that? I've got to find out."
Yeah.
You know? And that's the measure to me of good radio. If you can make people turn up the volume knob while they're listening, so, and listen to your end link so they can find out who that was, or wow, I haven't heard that for years, or I didn't know the chairman of the board did that. Wow, was that them as well?
Yeah. That kind of the discovery.
Yeah, and that is where DJs who were able to impose a lot of their own personality on their shows, and that's all gone. I mean, radio programs now are almost universally playlisted, and DJs have no flexibility.
Yeah.
So if you listen to a commercial station in Ireland or anywhere else, it's all coming up on a computer feed, song after song after song. The DJs, sometimes they can move things around. I mean, when I was doing the show on RTE Gold, we had a lot of freedom to mess with the playlist, to change it. But and the only rule we had is if we deleted a 60s track, we had to replace it with a 60s track. But that meant I might, or a 70s track. So I might delete an Eagles track, but I could throw in Tavares or something. So you're talking about, that was the only rule they had. But most radio stations, the DJs aren't allowed to do that.
Yeah.
And so they end up sounding the same.
Yeah.
And I mean, one day I was driving and listening to one Dublin station, a commercial station, and I heard a DJ do a link. He played a song and did a link, and he gave a little story or some information about the artist. The next afternoon, I was in my car again, heard the same song on a different station, DJ, very same link, because all they did was look it up on Wikipedia, So they didn't even, so for them, they had no connection to the music at all.
Yeah.
There was no sense of them saying, you guys are going to love this, or here's, this, or and I love the stories that go with records. So, I mean, everybody knows Screamin' Jay Hawkins, I Put a Spell on You.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, Jay wrote that song. His girlfriend dumped him, right? And he wrote that song about her trying to win her back, right? That's how that song started.
Yeah.
And 18 months later, or 2 years later, they actually got back together, right? And he was with her one night, and he asked her, did my song bring you back to me? And she said, no, I preferred the B-side. She didn't like the song at all. She only liked the
it
rock
made
and
no
roll
difference whatsoever. She liked the flip.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love those kind of anecdotes that you pick up along the way, and I just thought that was fabulous. Yeah.
Listen, this has been exactly why I was thrilled you've come on the show. We are going to have a part 2, Karl, so I want you to keep digging out the anecdotes.
I will.
Thank you, everybody, for watching in the record room. As I said at the start, please subscribe to the channel and like our videos. It means that we can get Karl back to tell more fabulous stories. Karl, it's been beautiful to have you on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barney.